June 28, 1914, a narrow street in Sarajevo. A 19-year-old student steps off a curb. He raises a pistol. He fires twice. Within 37 days, 5 empires are marching to war. 4 years later, those empires no longer existed. 9 million soldiers are dead. The map of the world has been redrawn in blood. His name was Gavrilo Princip. History remembers him as the man who started World War I. But that sentence is a lie of convenience. The truth is stranger, colder, and far more dangerous, because it means the war was never really about one man at all. It means the continent was already primed to destroy itself. Princip simply happened to be standing in the right place at the wrong moment, holding a gun. This is the story of how a single, almost accidental act tore open a wound Europe had been carrying for decades. It begins not in Sarajevo, but years earlier, in the war rooms and palaces of a continent that had convinced itself peace was permanent, right up until the moment it wasn't. By 1914, Europe looked stable on the surface. Empires stretched across the globe. Trade flowed between capitals. Kings and kaisers were, in many cases, literal cousins, bound by blood and marriage. But underneath that surface, something far more volatile had been building for a generation. The continent had split into 2 armed camps. On one side stood the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, though Italy's loyalty was never as solid as the treaty suggested. On the other stood the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and Britain. This partnership was built less on friendship than on shared fear of German power. Every major nation was racing to outbuild the others. Battleships, rifles, railways designed to move armies to the front faster than any war in history had ever demanded. Generals across Europe had drawn up detailed plans for mobilization. Once triggered, those plans were almost impossible to stop. Nationalism burned through every corner of the continent. Ethnic groups that had lived for centuries under foreign crowns now dreamed of nations of their own. Nowhere was that dream more dangerous than in the Balkans, a region so volatile that diplomats of the era had already nicknamed it the powder keg of Europe. At the center of it sat the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a sprawling, aging power trying to hold together more than a dozen ethnic groups under one crown. Among them were millions of Slavs. Many of them looked not to Vienna for their future, but to a small, fiercely independent kingdom to the south, Serbia. Europe did not need a reason to go to war. It needed an excuse. And in the summer of 1914, that excuse was about to walk into the story, though almost nobody watching him would have believed it at the time. Gavrilo Princip was born in 1894 in a poor village in Bosnia, then a province controlled by Austria-Hungary. He was sickly as a child, small for his age, more likely to be found with a book than a weapon. Bosnia's Slavic population lived under a crown they had never chosen. Many of its young people, Princip included, absorbed the revolutionary ideas sweeping through the region. Dreams of a South Slav homeland, free of empire. He fell in with a loose network of students who called themselves Young Bosnia, a movement united less by strict doctrine than by a shared hatred of the rule they lived under. Some of Young Bosnia's members crossed paths with a far more dangerous organization, the Black Hand, a secret Serbian military society with links inside Serbia's own army. The two groups were not the same, but their paths intertwined. Weapons reportedly passed from Black Hand hands into the fingers of the conspirators. One officer in particular, Dragutin Dimitrijević, head of Serbian military intelligence, is believed to have helped arm and organize the plot, even as Serbia's official government stayed in the dark. That's the part most textbooks skip. The assassination may not have been a lone act of youthful rage. It may have had roots inside a shadow network of military conspirators hidden from the very government whose flag they claimed to serve. Princip did not know in early 1914 what he was about to become. He knew only that the heir to the empire ruling his homeland was coming to Sarajevo, and he intended to be there. The man Princip was waiting for was Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. He was not universally loved, even inside his own empire. He had married beneath his royal station to Sophie, a woman of lesser nobility. The imperial court never fully forgave it, but abroad he was seen as the future of Austria-Hungary. On June 28, 1914, he arrived in Sarajevo to inspect military maneuvers. The date itself was a provocation, whether intended or not. June 28th was Vidovdan, a sacred day in Serbian memory, marking the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo in 1389. To many Bosnian Serbs, watching the empire's future ruler parade through their streets on that day felt like an insult dressed as ceremony. 7 conspirators lined the motorcade route that morning, spaced along the road like pieces on a board none of them could fully see. Princip was one of them. So was a young man named Nedeljko Chabrinovic. As the Archduke's car passed, Chabrinovic made his move first. He hurled a bomb toward the vehicle. It struck the folded roof, bounced off, and rolled beneath the car behind it. It exploded seconds later. Several officers and bystanders were wounded. Chabrinovic swallowed a cyanide pill and threw himself into the river, hoping to die rather than be captured. Both the poison and the river failed him. He was pulled out, arrested, and dragged away. The Archduke, shaken but unharmed, insisted on continuing the day's events. For a few hours, it seemed the plot had failed entirely. It had not. What happened next is one of the strangest, most fateful accidents in modern history. It is worth pausing on because it happened. It needs no embellishing. After the failed bombing, Franz Ferdinand made a decision that would cost him his life. He wanted to visit the wounded officers in the hospital. The route was changed to avoid the city center. But somewhere in the chaos of the morning, that change was never passed to the driver. The motorcade set off along the original route. At a junction near a small bridge, the driver, following the old plan, turned the car onto a side street. An official in the car realized the mistake instantly. He ordered the driver to stop and reverse. The car halted. By pure chance, it stopped only a few feet from where Gavrilo Princip happened to be standing. This was not part of any plan. Princip believed the mission was already over. He had not positioned himself for a second attempt. Chance, or bad luck, placed the target directly in front of him. Some later retellings claim Princip was standing outside a delicatessen at that exact moment, buying a sandwich when destiny arrived. It is a vivid image. It has been repeated in documentaries for a century, but many historians caution that this detail may be an embellishment added after the fact. What is documented, without dispute, is the wrong turn and the stalled car. Princip stepped forward. He drew his pistol. He fired twice at near point-blank range. The first bullet struck Franz Ferdinand. The second struck Sophie, who had thrown herself toward her husband. Within minutes, both were dead. The heir to Austria-Hungary had been killed not by a masterstroke of planning. He was killed by a failed bomb, a wrong turn, and a moment of extraordinary chance. If the story ended there, it might be remembered as a tragedy, a royal murder, a national scandal. It did not end there. What followed over the next 5 weeks is often called the July Crisis, and it reveals how the war actually began. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia's government for the assassination, despite no confirmed proof that Serbia's officials had ordered it. Vienna wanted to punish Serbia and reassert control over the Balkans once and for all. But Austria-Hungary knew it could not act alone. It turned to its closest ally, Germany, and asked for support. Germany's response became one of the most consequential decisions in modern history. It offered what came to be known as the blank check, an unconditional promise to back Austria-Hungary whatever action Vienna chose to take against Serbia. On July 23rd, Austria-Hungary issued Serbia an ultimatum so severe it was almost designed to be rejected. Serbia, remarkably, agreed to nearly every demand. It rejected only a handful of terms that would have surrendered its sovereignty to Austrian oversight. By the diplomatic standards of the era, it was a stunningly conciliatory response. It was not enough. On July 28th, exactly 1 month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. From there, the alliance system Europe had spent decades constructing did exactly what it had been built to do. Russia, bound by loyalty to Serbia, began mobilizing its army. Germany, alarmed by Russian mobilization, declared war on Russia. France, bound to Russia by treaty, was drawn in next. Germany declared war on France as well. When German troops crossed into neutral Belgium to strike at France, Britain, honoring its own commitments, declared war on Germany. In the span of about a week, 5 great powers were at war. A regional assassination in a provincial Balkan city had become a continental catastrophe, then a global one. By the time the guns finally fell silent 4 years later, roughly 70 million men had been mobilized to fight. Between 9 and 10 million soldiers were dead. Millions more civilians perished from starvation, disease, and the collapse of entire societies. Empires that had stood for centuries, the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian, the Ottoman, the German, simply ceased to exist. So the question remains, the one that gives this story its title: did Gavrilo Princip really start the First World War? The honest answer is both yes and no. Holding both truths at once is the only way to actually understand what happened. Yes, in the narrow sense. Without the assassination, there is no direct trigger for the July crisis. Austria-Hungary would not have issued its ultimatum. Serbia would not have been invaded. The chain of alliance obligations that pulled in Russia, Germany, France, and Britain would never have activated, at least not on that date in that way. But no, in the deeper sense. The tension behind that moment had been building for decades before Princip was even born. The arms race, the rigid alliances, the colonial rivalries, the unresolved nationalist pressures across the Balkans, none of that was created by one teenager with a pistol. Many historians argue that if Sarajevo hadn't provided the trigger in 1914, another Balkan crisis, another assassination, another border dispute would likely have provided one soon after. Europe's great powers had built a system that was, in a very real sense, waiting for someone to set it in motion. Princip pulled the trigger on a crisis that was already loaded. He did not design the system that made it possible. As for Princip himself, his story ends not on a battlefield, but in a prison cell. Because he was 19 at the time of the assassination, Austro-Hungarian law shielded him from execution. Adults involved in the plot could be and were hanged. Princip, too young under the letter of the law, was sentenced instead to 20 years in prison, the maximum allowed for someone his age. The conditions were brutal. He was held in a small, damp cell. His health failed under the weight of confinement. He contracted tuberculosis, and his body, never strong to begin with, slowly gave out. In 1918, in the final months of the war his act had helped ignite, Gavrilo Princip died in his cell. He was 23 years old. He never saw the armistice. He never saw the empire he despised collapse into ruin. He never saw the new nations rise from its wreckage, including, eventually, a South Slav state that resembled the union he had once dreamed of dying for. More than a century later, Gavrilo Princip remains one of history's most contested figures. In some places, he is remembered as a terrorist, a young radical who murdered an innocent man and his wife and, in doing so, helped unleash catastrophe on an entire generation. In others, he is honored as a freedom fighter, a symbol of resistance against imperial rule, a name inscribed on monuments and street signs. Both images are true, and both are incomplete. Princip was never powerful enough, alone, to cause a world war. He was one man in one street at one exact moment, when the moment happened to matter. Millions remember the shots fired in Sarajevo. Far fewer remember the decades of decisions that made those shots impossible to ignore. The alliances signed in quiet rooms, the armies built for wars nobody could name yet, the ultimatums written to be refused. History often blames one man. Reality rarely does. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to Dead Empires for more.